The other trick is to treat predictions as fact. And that's been going on in the climate change industry for a long time, regardless of how inaccurate the predictions have been. And they have been incredibly inaccurate. And we're supposed to operate off these predictions as though they're, I don't know, they're lock-solid fortune tellers.
It's worse than that, because actually what they did is, of course, this is Malthus again, right? So the Malthusians in the 60s, they go, hundreds of millions of people will die. That was the prediction. Okay, so it's one hand you go, who cares? So they're wrong with the prediction. But that's not what's going on. They say hundreds of millions of people will die, so therefore they should stop using fertilizer now. So they actually end up creating the crises that they say they're warning against. And this is what I'm documenting. They go, we're gonna run out of food in the future, so therefore we should run out of food now. That's basically what they're saying. We should cut back on the amount of fertilizer we're using. So we go, incompetence, or is it deliberate? And then, of course, when you go, you advocated cutting fertilizer, they go, yeah, I just went a little bit too fast that time. You kind of go, well, if you're reducing fertilizer, you're going to reduce how much food is being used.
And the parallel with climate is we're going to die in the future from a bad climate, so we might as well reduce our energy consumption today and let people die of starvation and heat and cold and whatever it may be today.
Yes, it's bad. And then when you point it out, then they retreat back into, oh, no, I was just trying to warn of it. And they retreat back into a more moderate position. And so then they end up getting gaslit. There's some gaslighting that goes on. I just did a piece yesterday where basically the two things that determine how abundant and cheap gasoline is whether you're producing enough oil and you have enough oil refineries. Democrats, and I used to be one, I'm not picking on them, but the fact of the matter is that Democrats have killed off attempts to build more oil refineries and to expand oil production. And then when you have gasoline shortages, because refineries, they've been running full out and they break down, there's maintenance problems. And then when there's problems, the Democrats turn around and they go, the oil refineries are ripping you off. There's not enough supply. You've been choking off supply of gasoline and of oil, and then you turn around and blame the oil companies. I'm not saying they're like angels or anything, but it's like I have a friend who's been saying, you make it sound like the government determines how much oil is being produced. And I'm like, yeah, it does to a large extent. The government gives out leases for public lands to be drilled for oil. It gives out offshore leases. And then it determines how many oil refineries can be built. All you have to do is just increase the regulations to restrict oil refinery capacity. So yeah, and then so the gaslighting then afterwards, because this is a game. Here you are choking off refinery capacity and oil production, and then you turn around and you blame the oil companies for it. Why does it even work anymore? That was my piece yesterday, and it works because people don't like oil companies for a variety of other reasons. And then if you don't like somebody, you just end up blaming them for all sorts of things that they probably don't necessarily deserve the blame for. Now that gets to then why are people demanding this radical sacrifice, this radical costs? Because they want to make people sacrifice. They want control. They want to tell other people how to live their lives. And so you can see there's been these ulterior motives behind so much of the climate alarmism.
So what is that? What are those motives? And I'm curious about this coming from the perspective you laid out earlier when you say sometimes I have to step back and go, what was my motive? When I look at some of this, and I want to go in a little bit deeper in just a moment about the flaws in the climate ideology, but I do wonder, what is the point? Is it control? Is it quite honestly, and sometimes you say these things and it sounds conspiratorial, but a globalist World Economic Forum view of the world into engineering us into the better life as they so envision? Is it utopic? Is it benign? Is it nefarious? Is it control? What is the motivation?
Yeah, the answer is yes to everything you just said. Let's start at the basic psychological level, and true for me too. If you listen to the basic dominant story in the society that humans are just animals and we're just instincts and you're just born and you reproduce and then you die and your life means nothing and you're not special, it's a pretty terrible story. And so most people go, I don't want that, and they react. And that's what you would call nihilism, is this idea that there's no purpose to life. A lot of people react to that story being like, well, I have to find some way to feel like my life has purpose. A lot of times that takes the form of becoming a consumer and look at me, I own these things, or narcissism, look, I'm my selfies. or the desire for power. I've got to control this desire to control others, to feel powerful in your own life, because otherwise you feel powerless. And you can get that fundamental, and with adolescence, to some extent, these things are very healthy among adolescents. I think there's some adolescent narcissism and messianic complex, which can be a healthy stage of development as long as you transcend, as you get out of it, as you become an adult and you get a more modest view of your own life. But I do think that sort of anxiety from fear of death and this desire for control, you definitely see that in the World Economic Forum. You see it at the United Nations, where we're going to control the world's energy supplies, and we've got to decide. I've been writing a lot about this war on fertilizers, this war on farmers, desire of bureaucrats in places like Brussels and the United Nations to control how Sri Lanka farms and to control how the Dutch farmers farm. And what we know is that farmers don't want to be polluting. They don't want to waste fertilizer. When you work with farmers, you can reduce pollution. This is actually true for all forms of producers. Generally have an incentive to improve the efficiency and reduce the pollution of their activities. And that's the right way to do it at the local level. Governments can have a role in it, but you don't want to be too heavy-handed either. And so this kind of heavy-handedness, this great reset, it's all true. And it's coming from an unhealthy psychology. It's and from a desire for control. I think that part of the conspiratorial stuff, pollution, Democrats in places like from fear of death, that there's no purpose to life. Humans are just animals, and we're just instincts, and you're just born, and you reproduce, and then you die, and your life means nothing, and you're not special. It's a pretty terrible story. And so most people go, I don't want that. And they react. And that's what you would call nihilism, is this idea that there's no purpose to life. A lot of people react to that story being like, I have to find some way to feel like my life has purpose. A lot of times that takes the form of becoming a consumer and look at me, I own these things, or narcissism, look, I'm my selfies. Or the desire for power. I've got to control this desire to control others, to feel powerful in your own life, because otherwise you feel powerless. And you get that fundamental, and with adolescence, to some extent, these things are very healthy among adolescents. I think there's some adolescent narcissism and messianic complex, which can be a healthy stage of development as long as you transcend, as you get out of it, as you become an adult and you get a more modest view of your own life. But I do think that sort of anxiety from fear of death and this desire for control, you definitely see that in the World Economic Forum. You see it at the United Nations, where it's like, we're going to control the world's energy supplies, and we've got to decide. I've been writing a lot about this war on fertilizers, this war on farmers, desire of bureaucrats in places like Brussels and the United Nations to control how Sri Lanka farms and to control how the Dutch farmers farm. And what we know is that farmers don't want to be polluting. They don't want to waste fertilizer. When you work with farmers, you can reduce pollution. This is actually true for all forms of pollution. Producers generally have an incentive to improve the efficiency and reduce the pollution of their activities. And that's the right way to do it at the local level. Governments can have a role in it, but you don't want to be too heavy-handed either. And so this kind of heavy-handedness, this great reset, it's all true. And it's coming from an unhealthy psychology. And from a desire for control. I think that part of the conspiratorial stuff that's not accurate, of course, conspiracies means that it's secret. World Economic Forum is anything but secret. It's actually the opposite. It's narcissistic. They have this Davos Forum, and I always point out, it's like, why do they always get caught flying private jets to climate conferences? Maybe they want to be caught. Maybe it's not an accident. Maybe it's a way of flaunting. Rich, powerful people, they want to flaunt their wealth. The fact that they're hypocritical, that just shows that they're special. So I think the part that's not accurate is that it's a conspiracy. It's actually the opposite. Is it's more of a festival of narcissism, desiring to control your lives. I think the part of the conservative movement that's accurate is that these guys are definitely trying to control things that they should not be trying to control.
I love that you laid that out. It's a festival of narcissism out in the open, but it's not conspiratorial. And yet it resides, at least in popular narrative, in the world of conspiracy. What I mean is, if you and I sit here and talk about ESG, environmental, social, and governance issues, or the World Economic Forum, we're fitted for a tin hat because, oh, there's no nefarious group of people trying to control when they're doing it and talking about it out in the open. I think it's so fascinating that the world, at least popularly, can't reconcile it to what's happening right there in front of your eyes. And by the way, playing out on the world stage, you've written about Sri Lanka, the effects. I'm fascinated by the lack of humility. And it's part and parcel with the narcissism you point out, like, oh, we made a mistake. It caused famine in Sri Lanka. Oops, we'll just adjust the knob in Brussels by a few degrees and we'll get it right next time.
I think the World Economic Forum is very interesting. I think it is nefarious. I also think they're bumbling and narcissistic and nihilistic in the sense that, like, they'll promote eating insects, but they'll condemn nuclear power, but they'll also promote nuclear power if somebody gives them money or something. I see it already happen, like the ESG movement, which is another of the kind of the menace that I think conservatives in particular are sensitive to. Now, like one of the biggest ESG guys is now pivoting towards nuclear. So they're very opportunistic too. And so they definitely want control over things they shouldn't control. They're not secretive. They're incompetent as much as they're competent. And you see it, right? And the consequence in some ways of the incompetence is really good, which is that, for example, these guys have been trying to deprive Africa of cheap energy, particularly fossil fuels, but also hydroelectric dams and nuclear power plants. Like Germany, I pointed out last year, Germany last year gave South Africa $800 million to not use coal to develop, which first of all is a terrible deal for everybody because, of course, coal to power, if you need cheap energy and you have coal, it's worth way more than $800 million to your economy. But second of all, Germany since then has imported 8 times more coal from South Africa. And so I think the Africans are seeing all this. And the United Nations last year behaved so badly. They had the CGI dinosaur with Jack Black as the narrator being like, you're all going to go extinct like the dinosaurs if you use fossil fuels, you Africans. It was the most patronizing, racist thing I'd seen come out of the United Nations. But I think African nations now are like, forget you. Like, you guys are all burning fossil fuels like there's no tomorrow, and then you're trying to deny us fossil fuels. So I do think it has a positive impact in that sense, too, and that the kind of more conspiratorial framing of the UN or ESG or WEF, I think, doesn't appreciate the ways in which the would-be masters of the universe are incompetent in creating the worst energy crisis in 50 years. I now see just literally before our call, I saw Biden administration. They're now saying, we released all that oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to give oil drillers enough time to ramp up production. Well, that's not at all what was going on. They were repressing oil production, but now they're starting to pivot and then re-narrate what happened in the past. And so anyway, I don't know if that answers the question, but I do think it's a really interesting time to watch the elites try to cover for the mistakes they've been making.
What's the grand vision of the elites? If there's some level of competence in executing their grand vision, and again, this is not conspiratorial, it's often laid out at the World Economic Forum. What is the grand vision with ESG and social credit scores and global control of energy? What do you think if they were able to competently execute their vision, what does our life look like?
Great question. So I think on the one hand, the first most important thing is more control and power for them. They want to be making more decisions at that level, at the global level, at the UN, at the WEF, and it's the banks, and they want to just move decisions up to them having control. That's like the most important thing. But I think the second part of it is that they want to reduce how much energy we consume. They also want to move us down the food ladder. I'm writing a piece right now called "They Really Do Want You to Eat Bugs." Because
but why?
I just was
why reduce the amount of energy? But real quick before you move on to that vision, I don't want to lose our place on that. I can't help but ask why. Yeah. Why do we have to move down the food ladder, and why do we have to consume less energy?
On the one hand, at a very basic level, if you want more power, they want more power. That means they want you to have less power, and power meaning less political power, less cultural power, less economic power, less wealth. And it's really basic. So energy is wealth. the correlation between high energy societies and wealth, it's just, there is no poor high energy society and there is no rich low energy society. So energy and wealth are like super tightly coupled. So if you want to keep Africa poor, just deny it energy. It's just, you see it in rich countries now too. That's why I'm saying this energy crisis was self-inflicted. It was decades of shutting down nuclear plants, shutting down natural gas and oil production, trying to reduce energy consumption. Now, I think just to get to what is conscious, what's unconscious, I think a lot of it is unconscious. So it manifests by saying, no, we want people to use energy, just want it to be renewables. But renewables don't provide the energy that an industrial society needs. That's why they like them at some level. And sometimes they're explicit about it. Sometimes they're not. I testified in front of Congress and I was pointing all this out, and some of the other witnesses were like, that's not true. That's not how we think about it. And I'm kind of like, yeah, because you just accept the dogma. Like, you weren't actually the people creating the dogma. The guys that created the dogma did say in the 60s, and they do say more privately still, we just have to reduce how much energy people use because that will reduce how much damage humans cause.
So back to that vision, taking us down on the consumption of energy, taking us down on the food ladder. What else does that life look like if they can competently execute their vision?
I think the bug stuff is really interesting. The bug stuff sounded so conspiratorial. Come on, you're not really saying the globalist elite want us to eat bugs. And then you go to the World Economic Forum website and you're like, I can't believe how many articles they have promoting insect consumption. It's really gross. There's just another article that came out showing that the British government has been financing a sort of, we say experiment, makes it sound sort of sinister, but it is a trial of feeding kids in Africa insect meal and trying to promote insect consumption. Again, it's just a kind of low energy way to consume protein. So I think that's part of it. I also think there's something like, it's a way to just put people down and kind of keep people down. So the United Nations signature program on energy is called Sustainable Energy for All. I wrote about it in the context of Haiti, where they promoted, these guys it's crazy. Like, they keep promoting, and I say they, okay, so it's United Nations, it's IMF, it's World Bank. They keep promoting that poor countries, and Haiti's one of the poorest, stop subsidizing fuel, gasoline and diesel for whatever. And they create these rationalizations like it's inefficient and it's better not to do that, better to fund other things. But every time they do it in Haiti, there's like riots because it means that the cost of riding the bus is going to go up. And that's everything. That's a huge part of your income. So why do they keep doing it? It's, on the one hand, you go, is it tone deaf and they're out of touch? But there is a way in which it's clearly just a way to keep people down. It's a way to keep countries, try to keep them under control, but then they just end up inspiring this incredible backlash, whether it's from the Haitians or the Sri Lankans or the Dutch farmers. People don't want to be put down. They know, people instinctively know this is why I actually really appreciate the populist revolt to this, because people can tell when they're being put down, and they're being put down.
A friend of mine, Ethan Strauss, who writes a Substack as well that focuses on the cross-section of sports and culture, he said this to me the other day, and I think it makes a lot of sense. Nobody wakes up, probably literally nobody, wakes up and looks in the mirror and says, today I'm going to be the bad guy. Nobody really says, I'm the bad guy that's going to keep people down. So one thing that you're laying out, Michael, that does make sense to me is this. I think inherently, as at least an economic conservative, I do subscribe, probably both consciously and unconsciously or subconsciously, to the idea that a rising tide lifts all boats. There's no zero-sum game. We can all live in a world where wealth rises for everyone. Maybe not at the same rate, but definitely at the same direction. But you're pointing out, and I've talked about it on this podcast, energy and power are directly tied to one another. You're exactly right. Look at the countries that have the most natural resources, and you'll see the most wealthy countries in the world. Energy and certainly power are zero-sum games. In order for me to be powerful, someone else has to be less powerful. That's not the same thing as wealth. And so I do think maybe deep down in the motivation, there is some acknowledgement, if I'm going to be powerful, that means I have to push somebody else down. But I do have trouble with the idea that whether or not it's the World Economic Forum or anybody that disagrees with Will Cain has woken up that day and says, I got to keep Haitians down so that I may be up.
Yeah, for sure. And let me just slightly amend what you were saying about resources, which is that like Japan is one of the richest countries in the world. It's a high energy society. They use a lot of energy, but they don't have a lot of their own energy supplies. And so part of the power of that culture is that they're like the Germans too. They're so well ordered, they then end up needing to take energy from somebody else. Yeah, for sure. You know, people wake up and they think the head of World Economic Forum, and they wake up and they go, I'm a powerful person and I have this responsibility to help ignorant people, foolish people who don't know how to manage their resources, to help them to manage their resources well. Look at the Haitians. They're wasting money on fossil fuels. And so we need to help the Haitians by cutting these wasteful fossil fuel subsidies. But it definitely starts with some arrogance there, which is to be like, I know what's best for these people in this other country. I think that conservatives have quite properly made the point that a lot of these decisions are best made at a more local level. Now, there's limits to that, and we have a federalist system in the United States, so the federal government has also played a really important role in things like building hydroelectric dams and nuclear power plants and highways. So there is a role, but there's also, hey, you know what? The Dutch farmers have actually done a pretty good job reducing nitrogen pollution, working with the federal government, working with the universities, but with the university professors and the federal government not coming in like arrogant know-it-alls, because farmers, they're brilliant. They're constantly solving problems. They are having to make these choices all the time. So they're not coming in as outsiders with this arrogant attitude, but they might come in, they might say, hey, we'd love to help you and work with you, but you're obviously the expert on your farm, and how can we help you to reduce fertilizer consumption? That's the sort of, it's a relationship of equals rather than the kind of WEF, UN, IMF, World Bank, we're superior knowledge. And that's the basic blind spot of liberals for hundreds of years, from eugenics to population control to all sorts of things. It's the arrogance of liberal elites to think that we know best and we're going to tell you what to do.
No doubt. You have just, in my estimation, pinpointed the core motivation, which is arrogance, a total lack of humility, which is pretty stunning when you combine it with a pretty amazing level of incompetence. To illustrate that lack of humility and that arrogance, one of my favorite stories when it comes to climate is to go back to the predictions of Thomas Malthus and point out that he said the world will not be able to support levels of population that we have since then way surpassed. Yeah. But the funny thing about Malthus is, and I've talked about this in the past, but the funny thing about Malthus is he wasn't wrong in his calculations. I'm sure in the way a lot of scientists aren't wrong today. He just was ignorant and showed a lack of humility in what the future may bring. He had no idea about fertilization. He had no idea about the internal combustion engine. He had no idea about cross-genetic pollination of crop growth. He had no idea that meant we had a bigger food supply and an exploding population. Arrogant and wrong. And he's only been perpetuated over and over by people, and you've written about Paul Ehrlich, who wrote, I believe the book is The Population Bomb. People continue to say this, that we are going to breed ourselves into extinction. And they're continuously wrong. But there's another motivation in there besides just incompetence and arrogance, right? The other one is there does seem to be some antipathy towards human beings. Like we're always the bad guy in the story. In that apocalyptic vision you talked about earlier, it's always our fault and we must be the ones that pay the price.
Yeah, and by the way, just on the Malthus and the Malthusians, there was contraception at Malthus's time. Contraception is actually is older. People think contraception is recent, but there was contraception, so there was reason to think that people could reduce family size and therefore reduce how many people there are and not have overpopulation. And there was also efforts to increase the productivity of agriculture during his time. Now, you're right that the big innovations came after he died. And so on the one hand, some of it was Malthus wrongly assumed that innovation would not be able to catch up to provide enough food for people. But he also dismissed the solutions in his time. And I think that's important because that's what other Malthusians have done over time. So you see in the 60s, we had nitrogen fertilizer. We had fertilizers, tractors to increase productivity of agriculture. And the Malthusians would find reasons to be against them. And we see the same thing with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. On the one hand, it goes, sure, I guess we could use nuclear, but there's all these problems with nuclear. Or you go, what about natural gas? Oh, yeah, but there's all these problems with natural gas. But renewables they describe as not having any problems when it's the opposite. Like the biggest problems are with renewables because they don't provide enough energy. They require too much land, too much material throughput. So you see with Malthusians this desire to achieve, to make a particular statement. We don't have enough resources. People are going to die. People would have to have less. We have to be poorer. That motivation to construct that, then they go and create analyses to support it. So your question, sorry, now I digress so much I forgot the question you asked.
Oh, the question was whether or not there was a third motivation, and that's this antipathy towards humanity.
Yeah. Now, this is interesting because, of course, when I was with Joe Rogan, because I said that too, I was like, it's like anti-human. He's, how is that possible? Because it's being proposed by humans. And it's kind of, and this is a very old strategy that humans have used, which is that, and we see it with the bugs thing, by the way, very dramatically. If I want you to eat bugs, then I'm going to go ahead and eat the bugs. Or what they do is they go get celebrities to eat the bugs. And it's like the celebrities will do a couple of times because they're thrill-seeking anyway, plus it's a way to pay attention to me. Look, I'm Nicole Kidman eating worms. It's like there's narcissism in it too. But it's also, I'm going to ride the bus, and therefore I can tell you how to live your life. There's some of that going on, and this is a very old strategy. It was described by Friedrich Nietzsche in the 19th century by ascetics, where it's, I'm going to go without, but then I gain some power over you, because that way I can say, look, I did it, I'm going to make you all do it too. So I do think it's still coming back to will to power. This is and also a Nietzschean concept, which was that really what's driving us is this desire to feel power over ourselves and other people. And it's bigger than a desire for wealth. It transcends all these other things, that power lies underneath them. And there's just different strategies to achieve that feeling of power.
So really quickly, just because you and I are having a conversation and it popped into my head. So what you just described then is I was reading this Russian proverb. I think it was an old Russian proverb, and it was this, or actually I heard it in a podcast by a guy named Daryl Cooper, something like this. But a guy finds a lamp, a brass or gold lamp in his yard. He rubs it and a genie pops out and he says, you have a wish, but whatever you get, your neighbor will get twice of. No, he says, what is your wish? And he says, I wish for an amazing home, a wealth, and boats. He starts debating it. And then as he's debating all these things that he wants, the genie says, I just want to tell you one caveat. Whatever you get, your neighbor gets double. And he goes, oh, in that case, I would like you to poke my eye out. And the genie's like, what? If you poke my eye out, you have to poke both of my neighbors' eyes out. So it's less about wealth and more about this constant comparative battle of envy with our neighbors, or power, as you described, because the feature is Nicole Kidman gets us to eat bugs, and it's a feature now, is that she then in turn doesn't eat bugs. It's that Gavin Newsom dines at the French Laundry while we don't. It's that they take jets to the World Economic Forum while we give up fossil fuels. I think that's a feature in the whole power dynamic. I want to ask you about some specifics that you write about that I think will highlight the arrogance and the incompetence, and then also the fact that it's a religion that is insulated from data.